and a postgraduate study in IT criminology and cybersecurity, and I'm currently carrying out an internship with the ECPS. And today I'm here to briefly introduce the panel. So the ECPS curates this panel series aimed at dissecting the diverse manifestation of populism across the world. And following the successful conclusion of our Mapping European Populism panel, we have embarked on a journey to explore populism beyond the border of Europe by expanding our Paris series to encompass a global perspective. And we titled it Mapping Global Populism. And our objective is to construct a comprehensive understanding of populism worldwide, thanks to monthly session. Today, as I said, we have our 13th session of Mapping Global Populism panel series. And the topic of today's session will be on Resurgence of Expansionist Tsarism, Populist Autocracy in Russia. So as a testament of our commitment to knowledge dissemination, we are going to write a panel report and share the video recording of this panel on our website and YouTube channel. So these resources serve as invaluable references for scholars, policymakers, but as well also as a wider audience concerned about the contemporary challenges to global democracy posed by populist and authoritarian politics. In the ongoing journey of our panel series, we extend our gratitude to all the scholars and experts who contributed their extensive insights. And with this, I will now get a bit more into the detail of today's session by introducing our esteemed moderator and the panelists that are going to be here with us today. So first of all, today's panel is going to be moderated by Dr. Maxine David, who is a lecturer in European Studies at Leiden University. She's a foreign policy analyst specializing in Russian and EU foreign policy. She has co-edited and contributed to several special issues and edited collection on EU-Russia relations. Dr. David also researches and is published on teaching and learning in higher education. Besides the foreign policy of this actor, Dr. David is interested in a range of foreign policy issues, including role of values, international intervention, regionalism, and social media. Dr. David sits on the International Advisory Board of the British Journal of Politics and International Relations, serves as the Leiden coordinator for Europeum, a 2-year master's in European Politics and Society program, and is a member of UREN. Moving forward, let's start introducing our speaker. So the first speaker of the day is going to be Dr. Luke March, presenting on the topic, Why Putin is Not a Populist, but Worse. Dr. March is a professor of post-Soviet and comparative politics at the University of Edinburgh. His research interests include the politics of European radical left, Russian domestic and foreign politics, nationalism, populism, radicalism, and extremism in Europe and former Soviet Union. His books include The Communist Party in Post-Soviet Russia, Radical Left Parties in Europe, and Europe's Radical Left, From Marginality to the Mainstream. His latest publication is the Palgrave Handbook of Radical Left Parties in Europe. Our second speaker of the day is Dr. Alessandra Jacek, discussing on social cultural justification for an imperial Russia under Putin's rule. Dr. Jacek is a researcher at IRIS CNRS at the University of Lille and a lecturer at Sciences Po. Her expertise covers post-Soviet nation building, populism, illiberalism, mega-event, and biopolitics. She is the author of numerous articles and books, including co-author The Critical Biopolitics of Post-Soviet, From Population to Nation, Lachman Cultural Semiotics and the Political, the co-edited mega-event in Post-Soviet Eurasia, Shifting Borderlines of Inclusion and Exclusion, New and Old Vocabularies of International Relations After Ukraine Crisis, and Boris Nemtsov, A Russian Politic, Power and Resistance. Moving forward, our third speaker is Dr. Yulia Gratskova, who is Associate Professor in History and Researcher at the Department of Gender Studies. She also works as a research coordinator at the Center for Baltic and Eastern European Studies at Södertörn University in Sweden. Her research interests include Soviet and post-Soviet social and gender history, the colonial perspective on Soviet politics of emancipation of women in the East, maternalism and transnational history. Currently, she is a PI in the project Maternity in the Time of Traditional Values and Female Nationalism. Her last book is The Women's International Democratic Federation, The Global South and the Cold War. defending the rights of women of the whole world. Greskova is the author of Soviet Politics of Emancipation of Ethnic Minority Women, Nationalska, and co-editor of several books, including Gendering Post-Colonialism, Old Legacies and New Hierarchies. And moreover, today, Dr. Greskova is here with us to deliver a presentation titled Traditional Values, Gendered and New Imperial Dimension in Russia. Last but not least, our fourth and last speaker of the day is Dr. Dora Jorfi, presenting on the topic, The Economic Costs of Autocracy in Putin's Russia. Dr. Jorfi is a professor at the Institute of Economics at Corvinus University of Budapest. She is chair of the Economics Committee of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. Her research focuses on issues of international political economy, with a particular focus on the post-communist EU member states. She is the author of 4 monographs, including Institutional Trust and Economic Policy, as well as Trust and Crisis Management in the European Union. She has published over 70 scholarly articles and book chapters in English and Hungarian, most recently, The Middle Income Trap in Central and Eastern Europe in 2010s, The Institution and Divergent Growth Model, and Neo-Backwardness and Prospects for Long-Term Growth, the effect of Western sanctions on Russia and the changing embeddedness of Ukraine in the world's economy. So after presenting our panelists, I just wanted to remind you that we do have a Q&A session after the completion of the presentation. So for our participants, if you have a question, you can either write it in the chat box or raise your virtual hand and pose your question in person. I will leave now the floor to Dr. Maxine David, who will present an overall view of populist authoritarianism in China and administer the panel. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Chiara, for that introduction. I'm actually not going to say too much because I think we have got 4 experts here who the audience really want to hear about. So just let me introduce the kind of context in which we are talking about this a little bit more. First of all, I really want to thank the Centre for the work that you do in the context of our very deep fears and justifiable fears about the future of democracy across the globe, and really including in Europe, where we can no longer afford to be complacent about our democracies. It's so important that we have a centre like yours. EU-Russia relations for a number of years now. I've been very focused, particularly in the EU context, on the role of the member states in the EU's relations with Russia, and therefore I have been concerned with the domestic politics of Russia, but also the EU member states for a long time. Chiara also mentioned that I'm a member of URAN. So at the current time, URAN, which was the EU-Russia expert network, no longer exists. And it's just one sign of the deterioration in EU-Russia relations. So URAN was funded largely by the European Union, but also the Russian International Affairs Council. And it brought together experts from ambassadorial level, but including think tanks, practitioners, academics from across Europe and more widely. So that is a set of conversations, a dialogue that doesn't exist anymore since February 2022, when we've effectively not been able to function. I don't want to tread too much on the arguments of the speakers here, but I do think that it is very important that we have firm understandings of what populism is and is not, and also autocracy. I don't want to tread too much on Professor March's arguments, but I think he's right to caution that we should not overplay the role and significance of populism in contemporary Russian politics. With so much emphasis on the state then that we see in Putin's discourse and that of other elites, it's really right to kind of debate whether the populist label has a lot of explanatory power when it comes to Russia. Given, however, the fact that I have focused on EU-Russia relations for a long time, we do see that populism really, really matters when it comes to the member states, because we see some of the member states really picking up on some of the discourse, the narratives that come out of Russia, although I also would like to say that this is still very much within the kind of purview of the EU member states, so it's their agencies too. But we have seen in studies that there is a connection between support for right-wing populist parties elsewhere in Europe to more positive views of Russia. Pew Research Center studies since February 2022 have shown a decrease in that, notably in Italy, but also in France, in Hungary, and Germany. But still, the same study shows that there's no reason to be complacent about it, because right-wing populist supporters are still more likely to have positive views of Putin and of Russia generally. And if we are to keep any kind of solidarity of support for Ukraine and condemnation of Russia together, it is very important that we are kind of laser focused on the far right, but also, I think, as Professor March is going to show, on the far left as well. People like me who have been looking at this for a relationship for a very long time have also spent the time since February 2022 doing a little bit of soul searching, thinking about what and who we did not talk and think about too much in EU-Russia relations. So I'm very, very happy to see that we will really have this emphasis from Dr. Greskova on gender, because we have, I think, been so focused on making the relationship work that we haven't always thought very, very much about who and what is being represented in Russia itself. And so women have not been sufficiently centered, I don't think, in the work that we have done on Russia. Equally, I would say, and this is so important, of course, for populism and thinking about, well, who are the people that are supposedly represented by populist, in populist states and by populist leaders, but minority groups, particularly indigenous peoples as well. And so this, I think, has largely been missing from our scholarship. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, that it hasn't, but I'm saying that it hasn't been sufficiently centered. And I certainly, considering all the editing work that I've done, have thought that I bear some responsibility for that as well. So again, I think that this conversation is very, very important. Not only in kind of understanding what is happening within Russia itself, but the links to other countries. I've talked about Europe, but of course this matters in the wider global context as well, as we have seen at least not as much condemnation as we would have liked to have seen in the EU of Russia's actions in Ukraine. And so while I think that Biden's kind of conceptualization of the world being divided into authoritarian and democratic regimes is too crude, too binary, at the same time, there is something there in terms of this kind of autocratic versus democratic divide. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from our four speakers about all of this and then so much more. On that note, then, I would now like to hand over to our first speaker, and Chiara has very, very nicely talked to us through everybody's biographies. So I'm just going to hand the floor over in turn, and the first speaker is Professor Luke March. Wonderful. The floor is yours, Luke.
Okay, thanks. Thanks so much for the invite. Can everyone see the slides? Is that okay as we, yeah, brilliant. Now I need to explain the title, which is a little bit provocative, I think, given the focus on populism in the title and in whom I'm actually talking to. And what I mean by this is not at all that we can't use populism to identify aspects of Putin and particularly the wider Putin regime, particularly media, and maybe some of my colleagues are going to do that in their presentations. It's just, and Maxine did this very, very well in the introduction, it's just it needs to be heavily caveated. And I think we can certainly identify populist elements in Putin's leadership. I don't think this is the primary way that we should understand Putin. And if we give too much focus on that to the exclusion of other elements, or we don't see how populism interacts with other elements in Putin's ideology and the Putin regime, then we're missing something. So it's at best a little bit selective, at worst it's quite misleading. Why I say he's worse than a populist is if we understand, obviously populism is a contested term, but there's a consensus over the core of it, which is that it's a kind of illiberal democratic emphasis on the dichotomy between a good people and a bad elite. If that's all we had to worry about in Russia, we'd be thinking something along the lines of Orban's Hungary. We'd be thinking of pressurized elections, pressure on the judiciary, pressure on the opposition, politicized anti-corruption campaigns, etc. But as anyone who focuses on Russian politics knows, we're probably 20 years past that point. We're now dealing with a country which is not so much illiberal as anti-liberal, particularly since 2012, is outright authoritarian and makes an authoritarian challenge to the West, a kind of militarized authoritarian challenge to the West. Some of that is packaged under a populist kind of discourse, but there's a lot more going on. And the worst element of it is that Putinism focuses very much on imperial nationalism, outright oppression, and all kinds of other elements that just aren't really captured by populism. Some of these are fleshed out in the article that I have there, which talks about this in more depth. And I'm kind of taking some selections from that. What I'm not doing, although, again, Maxine keyed this up very well, but just simply for reasons of time, I'm focusing on the domestic. I'm not actually going to focus on in the presentation on the connection between Putin and populists abroad and the radical left. Very interesting topic, can deal with it in questions if necessary, by all means. So moving on, why this is a kind of certainly an academic and practical debate is that Putin is a contested figure in populism literature. There are many, many accounts, which particularly media accounts, but not just, which like this one make a kind of seamless transition between particularly right-wing populists, Trump, Bolsonaro, Orban, you kind of Erdogan, you can name it, and Putin. And they're seen as the kind of similar politicians with the same playbook. For all that, there's an equally big and vocal school of thought that says it's completely obvious that Putin's not a populist and he's more a nationalist, and populism is again, selective, and it's a simplistic way of packaging a lot of different things such as sexism, machoism, nationalism. And in a nutshell, I'm more on the latter side of this debate. What I'm doing is I'll kind of flesh this out in the discussion here is kind of, and I do it more in the article, is I take different aspects of the populist literature and I try and apply them to Putin and see how far they take us. And they take us some way along, but not really enough. So, different definitions of populism sometimes focus on style and communication and leadership style. And a lot of this says that Putin is the archetypal bad boy, macho, populist, the kind of drunk dinner guest, the kind of person who breaks taboos, presents himself as an outsider, is unruly, presents himself as the Superman, someone kind of very kind of above normal, but extra normal. So he identifies with the normal person, but he's got kind of superhuman qualities. And particularly in the UK, and I'm sure it's also fairly similar in continental Europe, but in the UK, we have a very non-deferential relationship with our leaders. We kind of make fun of this. So Putin on horseback, Putin with his motorbikes, the kind of crass jokes about wasting terrorists on the outhouse, that even crasser kind of rape jokes that Putin sometimes makes, particularly to foreign leaders. and kind of explicitly before the invasion of Ukraine as well. So this is kind of the playbook of Bolsonaro, Trump, etc. And there's a lot to be said about that. That is one aspect of Putin's leadership style. But again, in terms of the consistent thing of this takes us so far, it doesn't take us far enough, because again, studies of leadership show that there's multiple different personae going on, and Putin is fairly inscrutable. Putin acts as a kind of target that's impossible to hit. He kind of all things to all people, but there's definitely an aspect which is not captured by populism, which is him as the state builder, the sober, the kind of CEO of Russia, the history man, the kind of guardian of Russia's state traditions. And in this, he has a very non-populist style where he speaks in more high-blown rhetoric. He might quote philosophers from particularly the 19th century, like Ilyin, and latterly he'll talk about Solzhenitsyn and others. And you know, his presentation is very much not as an outsider. It's an organization man who has continuity, and people all know about his biography, continuity with the Soviet state structures, particularly the security services, but very much the kind of state builder, the builder of a great state, which I think is really the core of what he's doing. Again, this tailoring itself to different audiences is something that's consistent, and sometimes that's populist, sometimes it isn't. If we focus on there's a view of populism that focuses on leadership strategy and charismatic leadership and the relationship of leadership with followers, and how populist leaders can have big cults which kind of cross the party system and involve movements, involve devotion. Then again, there's a lot to be said, and this literature does quite often say that Putin is a kind of archetype here, and yes, he has a kind of frenzied support from certain aspects of the population. He has these kind of mass meetings with sometimes journalists, but sometimes the population as a whole. So this on the left is his kind of results of the year, his kind of direct line where he takes questions from the population, and he sometimes lambasts officials, and he kind of shows that he's in touch. And these are kind of quasi-populist events that people looking for Putin's populism will say, this is him at one with his people. This is him who as the kind of empty signifier, if we want to look at it that way, representing the people versus the kind of others. Again, something in that, but selective. So, and critics of the populist viewpoint point to a whole lot of other things that kind of build on the statist organizational element that I've been talking about, and where his leadership can be seen as kind of much more aloof, much more distant, much more kind of imperial, not in the terms of expansionist sense, but the kind of the augustness of the Russian Empire, and kind of monarchical. Again, relating to the title of today's topic, the Tsar. Again, it's a cliche, but there's a certain amount of truth in it. And we can see this through all kinds of mechanisms. A lot of his inaugurations are kind of a meeting of the kind of a very, very monarchical. He clears the streets for his motorcade. His meetings, particularly during COVID, showed this kind of aloof leadership who's not really in touch, who's kind of very distant. A lot of his public events, as far as we know, are very, very stage managed, choreographed, and rely on a core of paid activists. So they're not as spontaneous. It's not this kind of occult that it actually appears. So again, populism selective, but more going on. What I do in the article at somewhat kind of greater depth is really go into what Putin stands for, because ultimately, even though I'm addressing different viewpoints on populism, I kind of broadly speaking sit in the ideational school, which is that populism is about ideas. And so if we want to look at someone's populism, we need to look at what they say and how they say it, and what this substantively means in terms of the articulation of people versus elite. And so I identified a range of the kind of keynote speeches from Putin's period in office, from 99 through to 2023, and I coded them. There's details on that in the paper. I coded them for the three aspects under one of the core definitions of populism, which are people-centrism, anti-elitism, and emphasis on popular sovereignty, i.e. what does it take to make the people rule? And the findings, again, if they're kind of delineated into three lines here. The top line, which wavers, but is clearly dominant, the top dotted line is people-centrism. So Putin is people-centric, which means that he identifies himself as close to the people, and he does this with fluctuations, but very consistently. But this doesn't tell us very much. And again, the literature says that being people-centric is a fairly kind of entry-level requirement of a politician these days who's appealing to the people. And I refer to it more as demotic than populist. It's a kind of necessary but not sufficient. Identifying yourself with the people, everyone does this. But in order to be populist, you have to mobilize that identity against an elite. And that's where Putin is lacking. We don't find much anti-elitism or popular sovereignty. I can talk more about the details in questions. There are a couple of speeches where this peaks, and it is generally in foreign policy, and it is generally about foreign elites. There's a little bit on the domestic oligarchs, but it's almost absent otherwise. It's about Turkish elites get attacked at one point, but it's about Ukrainian elites, the coup, that kind of discourse that we're familiar with. It's about the Western elites which stand behind it. So there is a foreign policy discourse that's periodic, which is about the nefarious Western elites who kind of rig Ukrainian politics against Russia. But that said, it's also packaged within a broad anti-Westernism. So it's kind of quasi-populist. But what is missing from it is any sense in which the Ukrainian people or the Russian people or the global people need to be empowered against the elites. It seems still very kind of state-centric in terms of the Russian state will look after it. The Russian state will look after the Ukrainian people because of their historical ties, that kind of argument. As a kind of move towards a conclusion here, and the implications of this. If we take a multifaceted look at Putin, and what I should again reinforce, Putin is not quite Putinism, and Putinism is not quite the entirety of the Russian regime. So what I'm not saying is there's no populist elements in the Russian media or the Russian opposition. What I'm saying is let's take Putin as a figure, as a leader. Is he a populist or not? And I'd say no. On balance, because there are some elements, they're not systematic and they're not core. The stylistic definition has partial applicability in terms of he can present himself as this macho bad boy at times, but he often doesn't. And that's kind of in stage managed events, quite often during election periods. The ideational approach in terms of what he articulates really shows the very limited element of this, because as I said, there isn't very much at all in terms of populist rhetoric, populist ideology in his domestic politics. And one can imagine many kind of logical reasons why this isn't the case. And clearly, the most obvious one is that I believe populism is about mobilization of the people versus the elite. It can be a pretense of doing that. It doesn't have to be a kind of full-blooded mobilization, but there needs to be that kind of pretense. That mobilization of people versus elite in Russia would be dangerous for the elite. It's against the biography of Putin, his mentality, his experience as a security officer. They want to dampen things down. They want the dominance of the state. The Russian political system is profoundly anti-mobilizational. It involves depoliticization. It involves co-option. And then we can see this kind of archetype is during the war, which, as people here will know, isn't called a war. It's the special military operation, and mobilization is partial and is not really acknowledged. So the idea that you would get the population to you would mobilize the population against anything outside state control is really anathema, I think, to the elite. So I think Putin's demotic, he's close to the people, but he's an anti-mobilizational leader, and the use of populism is selective and sometimes strategic, but again, partial. And if we want to kind of link it back to why Putin is far worse than being a populist, which again, I'd see as a form of illiberal democracy that is challenging, but isn't as fundamentally dangerous as what Putin represents. His full core ideology is statism, imperialism, conservatism, and nationalism, and probably a few other things side as well. Populism is in the mix, but it's not the thing we have most to worry about. And at that point, I will finish. So thanks a lot.
That's lovely. Thank you very much. I think that's given us a lot to think about. I particularly thank you for the nuance in terms of kind of navigating what is a really kind of complex situation. I did forget to say at the beginning as well that I really kind of congratulate the Centre for bringing in Tsarism, just because it's got then this echo of the fact that we really need to understand our history as well. And I think that this is implicit in some of what you have said, and certainly will be in what others, or explicit in what others will talk about as well. Our next speaker is Dr. Alexandra Jacek. I do also just want to kind of talk a little bit about, think a little bit, I suppose, about the different disciplines that we need to bring to bear here in order to understand what is going on in Russia, but with populists generally. And so I'm very happy to see that we have got a sociologist in Dr. Jacek, but also with some feet in political science and administration, and a research focus that has been on culture and society as well. And thinking about that history in different terms, I think Dr. Jacek also looked at heritage with a focus on Estonia, and we know, of course, that there has been so much about monuments, and that history generally has been a real battlefield, and that Putin has used this, unfortunately, very, very ably. I will stop talking now, and I will hand over to Dr. Jacek for her contribution. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Maxine. I'm going to share my slides. Well, so I would say that I populist in terms of classical sense, because he actually never participated in political debates. He never was interested even in competing with others in a sense of real political fight. He actually, yes, he is using this kind of appealing to people, especially at stadiums, and he is trying to demonstrate that he is one of us, he is one of the ordinary citizens, but actually at the same time he preferred to keep isolated, he preferred to be very well protected and keep distance from the people at any kind of meetings, and he actually his behavior is really
sorry, Alexandra, you're breaking up
absolutely,
a little.
Is definitely. Well, unfortunately, yes, because I'm afraid that it can be a problem.
I just wonder if you turned your camera off. I know it's not ideal,
okay,
but that might help.
Yes. Yeah. Is that better?
So far, yes.
Can you hear me well?
I'm much better now.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, good. So what I'm trying to focus today is Another aspect of Putinism, which is, as I said, I don't think is a populist rhetoric, but it definitely contains some populist arguments. And as Luke said, and I again completely shared his argument that is mostly focused on foreign policy. There is a kind of anti-rhetoric, but the address that actually is not the not elites, but those who are kind of abroad. So this is a Western, anti-Western rhetoric. So, and also Putinism also contains, or Putinist populist rhetoric also contains the idea of the inner enemy, which again, an enemy like those who are not loyal to the state, and also all kind of social groups, including so-called liberals, and also people who do not share these traditional values like LGBT people or queer people. But I would say that the key rhetoric of Putinism, not exactly Putinist populist rhetoric, is focused on two ideas. So the ideas of security and sovereignty. And here we can see two, I would say, security shields, which are also emphasized by Putin, by his allies, like, for example, Russian Orthodox Church, or those who share his conservative rhetoric, like, for example, neoconservatists, like Izborsk Club, or also other allies. And today I would like to focus on actually on two aspects, like Russian sovereignty and nuclear arsenal in his rhetoric, but not only in his rhetoric, but also in the rhetoric of neoconservative thinkers, like, for example, Alexander Dugin, and also the rhetoric of populist popular culture, or so-called Z singers. So I would like to present some ideas how the idea of sovereignty and nuclear arsenal are spread by Z singers. So talking about the idea of sovereignty and nuclear arsenal, I would say that it is built around the idea of Katechon, which is actually a kind of phenomena or concept which came from theosophy, from philosophy, and this idea means a figure who restrains the apocalyptic forces, and the image of this Katechon actually ascribed to Roman Empire or empire. The idea that Katechon as a restraining should protect the world from the Antichrist. And in Russian philosophy, Katechon is developing the concept of the Third Rome in the 16th century. And from this time, the idea of Katechon and the Russian Tsar as a Katechon is being very actively developed in philosophy and philosophy, and also in politics. And in Russia, this idea of Katechon, Russian Katechon, and Russian sovereignty as a Katechon has been developing by Russian neoconservative projects, including Alexander Dugin, Alexander Prokhanov, Izborsk Club, and such figures like Konstantin Malafeyev, Kolmogorov figure, and also they focus on the idea of geopolitical imperial revanchism, messianism, anti-Westernism, and as Lucas already said, and also the idea of political orthodoxy or agiopolitics, which means actual militant defense of Russian spiritual uniqueness and civilization. So Dugin became an important figure in terms of spreading and promotion the idea of Russian Katechon and Russian sovereignty as a Katechonic sovereignty. And he became especially important since the full-fledged invasion of Ukraine, If you look at, for example, what he's saying about Russia's mission and also SVO, the special military operation towards Ukraine, he's saying that this war has a special meaning in terms of fighting against the evil, and this is actually the final battle between the armies of God and Satan. And we can clearly see the eschatological meanings of this war. So Dugin became very active in sense of promotion the idea of the great mission of Russia, including this war. And also he became an important figure in terms of being a public speaker, because he is invited the high-ranked political events and also philosophical events. He became a head of a new center named after Ivan Ilyin, who is a kind of fascist philosopher and considered like a favorite philosopher of Putin. So in this regard, the idea of Russian mission as empire, as a protector of the world from the evil, and on the evil, the neoconservative world, and also Putinism understands this the wider West. So the second idea is an idea of Russia as a nuclear orthodoxy, and the idea that Russia has a divine nature, which has to protect its sovereignty in every possible way, including, for example, nuclear weapon. And we see that this idea of nuclear weapon as a sacral thing, as a weapon which allows Russia to keep its position as a catechon, as a restrainer of the Antichrist, actually produced by not only this neoconservative, but also, for example, Russian Orthodox Church. We see, like after the invasion, Patriarch Kirill said that Russia feels free because of the nuclear weapon, and also he numerously emphasized that this nuclear weapon has a sacral nature, also divine nature, and actually it is invented with the help of God for Russia to protect Russia's sovereignty. And again, this is a direct idea of Russian mission as a catechon, as a sacral mission to protect the world from the evil. And the idea of nuclear orthodoxy and the divine nature of nuclear arsenal also can be seen in Russian art, for example, representing the idea of nuclear orthodoxy by neoconservative artists, Belyaev Gintov and Andrei Molotkin, which they presented in 1999 in the exhibition in Paris. So you see this nuclear submarine in Arctic, among ices, and a kind of light behind it. So my point is that actually this is not only political Putinism or political rhetoric, but also a wide range of popular culture figures who help this Putinist populist rhetoric to spread the idea of imperialism, Russian revanchism, and the idea of security. And here we can see the clear reference to these two security arguments, to Russian security shields in works of so-called Z singers of Putinism. And these are people, these are artists who very actively produce the idea of Russian mission, the idea of Russia as a catechon, and the idea of nuclear orthodoxy in Russian popular culture. And I would like to present three figures. They are not new in Russian popular scene. They started their career before the full-fledged invasion, but actually they became very popular because of the invasion. So these are three figures like Yulia Chicherina, who is a Russian rock singer, and she reached her popularity in 2000s. Also, she became very active during the war in Donbass in 2014, and then she became more and more popular with her messages focused against the Russian enemies, against the Russian imperialism. So she also supported Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And she is very active in promoting the idea of Russia as a great, strong country. Very active participant participant is Akim Atachev, who is actually a very interesting figure because he is a Mariupol native. And again, he became known in Russia by his new coverage of 2014 Donbass War. And especially he became famous because of the full-fledged invasion of Ukraine. And he has his own agenda in promoting the idea of Russian mission, especially being a Mariupol native, which is a very kind of important thing. He is trying to reinterpret Ukrainian songs, which, for example, the song Culture, which is actually an anthem of Ukrainian forces and Ukrainian identity. So he's trying to reinterpret this Ukrainian cultural legacy from Russian imperial position. And the first figure is Shaman, who is the most popular Russian Z singer, and also not Z singer, simple singer. And he became very famous after the invasion. He is a participant of Putin's electoral campaign this year. And again, he is categorical sovereignty and eschatological meanings, etc. So these are key narratives of Putin's singers. I would say that we can see these neoconservative eschatological meanings in their songs. For example, you see the lyrics, extract from lyrics. You see that we can find here, for example, such expressions as Ark of Salvation, or, for example, Russia as a bearer of peace, and etc. And interestingly, that, for example, we can see direct relations between the songs and the lyrics, which are written by neoconservative writers like Alexander Prokhanov. So we can see the direct relations between this neoconservative discourse and popular culture. Another example is example of Russian colonization.
Sorry, Alexandra, just got about a minute left, please.
Yes, so I'm finishing. So another example from these key narratives is the idea of cultural colonization of Ukrainianness, which is a kind of new thing. And again, we can find it in popular culture in works of this Akim Atachev and his contributors. So interesting thing how they reinterpret the idea of Ukrainianness from the imperial mission, imperial Russian mission. So they basically what they done, they actually put a new words, new lyrics on the same melody, very important song, Pude Culture, and you see the completely different lyrics, which are telling the story about the fighters in Azovstal, who are the demons, who are actually fighting against the right country. And actually, in this song, he is singing that as being a Mariupol native, he is very much regret about the destiny of Mariupol as being the Ukrainian city. And actually, he is singing in Ukrainian, which is more interesting thing. And so you see the extract from this song, which says that this is my home, my Crimea, my land, and I'm also taking the language, meaning the Ukrainian language. And the last point I would like to make is the narrative about the normalization and aestheticization of the nuclear explosion, which again, a very important part of Putin rhetoric and the rhetoric of politicians like, for example, Dmitry Medvedev, and the idea of nuclear explosion as a kind of weapon against the West, as a final weapon against the evil. And in popular culture, for example, in works of Shaman, we can see the normalization of this discourse. So, and here the pictures which depict the idea of nuclear explosion as a way of kind of as an aesthetic way. And also we can see that the direct relations between the aesthetics of Putinists, popular culture, especially in Shaman's work, and with fascist aesthetics. A lot of scholars mentioned this kind of relations between Shaman's view. For example, you can see his appearance on the background was a Russian cathedral, and the Nazi aesthetics of kind of Nazi guy. So, and to conclude my idea, I would like to say that actually the idea of eschatologism and the idea of nuclear weapon are two basic narratives of Putin. And this is not just the political rhetoric, but also very much supported by popular culture and spread by popular culture. And so we can say that populism is a sort of collective action. So this is not just what is produced by politicians. So this is a collective product produced by many allies and many social groups, including, for example, in Russia's case, Russian Orthodox Church and also popular culture. So I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Maxine, you are mute.
Yeah, sorry, that's what I couldn't find my mute button. I thought I'd unmuted. Thank you very much. So thank you, Dr. Jacek. So important, I think, to have this focus on culture in terms of thinking about how messages really carry, and particularly through the generations. And I'm wondering whether one of the questions that we will have for you is about which part of the populace these types of messages really resonate with. So do they extend to older generations, or are they most effective in younger generations? But we'll see if that comes up in the questions. But thank you, really invaluable insights there. So our next speaker then is Dr. Julia Gradskova, and I've already said a little bit that really important that we get this kind of focus on women and gender, and this is absolutely what you bring to the table for us today. Thank you very much, and I will hand over to you now.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me like this better, probably, yeah?
Yeah, I think if you're just holding your mic up close to, then yeah, that's good. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, you mentioned already, Dr. Maxine David, that that gender is a very important dimension of what is going on in Russia. So I will speak in particular about traditional values, and Putin's government presents traditional values as a genuine value system based on social cohesion that can guarantee social harmony and peace. And in my presentation, I want to show that these ideas are affecting individual rights and freedoms of several categories of citizens of the Russian Federation, and they are also used for gathering popular support for the new imperial Russian war on Ukraine. Traditional values are not established definition. They are frequently combined with family values, traditional family values, and mainly indicate kind of normalization after the communism, prizing happy family life, in particular caring about children's well-being, For example, the infamous law against LGBTQ plus propaganda from 2013, it was mainly focused on protection of minors from non-traditional values, how it was presented. The traditional values declaring importance of family life and family happiness, but at the same time the demographic anxiety is somehow always present in all the discussions. The low birth rate is something problematic. That Russia can die out. It started not now. It was promoted by some primarily minor groups, mainly connected to the Russian Orthodox Church. Here you can see something from 2012 Pro-Life Festival, Formula of the Death of the Nation. However, if we compare it to reality now, in the context of the war after the beginning of the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the birth rate is continuing to fall down. For example, in 2022, it was 11,6, and 2023 is 11,3 children born per 1,000 of the population. In spite of this reality, traditional values are praising motherhood. Motherhood is very valuable. A mother is the best social role for women. Full respect for mothers is promised, and of course it is supposed to attract women. Assumed that all women want to be mothers. These politics are promoted, as I said, by different organizations. First of all, they usually attributed to the Russian Orthodox Church, of course, and to organizations directly connected to it. For example, here on the right, you see the webpage of the Patriarchal Commission for Family and Protection of Motherhood and Childhood. This commission is organizing, starting from the late 90s, so-called Christmas reading, which is discussing how it is better to distribute traditional values in Russia, and many powerful figures, representatives of government, of the parliament are visiting this commission. Also, some representatives of women's organizations are present in this Christmas reading. When we are discussing traditional values in Russia, we should speak about conversion of different actors. Here's another example. Organization Sanctity of Motherhood, which is doing special contest for those who could better convince women not to make abortion. Here you see mainly women are representative of this organization, and it enjoys presidential grant for this activity. Situation with abortion in Russia is getting worse and worse. What this organization is using is so-called Week of Silence, introduced in Russia in 2011. It is supposed 1 week after making application for abortion, a woman should be sent to priests or to special psychologists who are trying to, by different way, convince her that she should not make an abortion. But now abortion are really more in danger to be totally left out of the medical insurance system, and at the same time they are mainly forbidden by the private clinics and private medical services. When we see the latest changes of legislation in the country after the February 24 of 2022, we see that traditional values became much more important, much more in the center of the public life. together with these activities for promoting the war, militarism, and they intertwined really with these activities. So first of all, it is of course all kind of promises to mothers who give birth to many children, including that the Soviet heroine mother status would be reestablished. At the same time, the public holiday, a day of love and fidelity, which was still not, still was working day first, but now it is non-working day. Patriotic lessons in school, president decree about traditional values buying a state ideology, and finally, a much stricter law against LGBTQ plus people, which from January this year, 2024, is practically accusing everybody and everything which can be seen by the prosecutors as connected to LGBTQ values is extremism. So the charges, the criminal charges on extremism are implicated for people who are showing LGBTQ plus identity. Also trans people, trans identity is also fully outlawed. The declaration as against child-free people, also made by politicians, starting from Putin himself, but also on the regional level, on different levels. This is what is happening recently, but if we kind of generalize what do traditional values mean for women, what a woman is expected to do, we see that really it is not very good situation with respect to women's rights. A woman is expected to give birth to several children, not one, not two, but several, for reproduction of the nation, for producing soldiers also now for the war, to kill Ukrainians. Also, woman should be the main caregiver. It is not like in the Soviet Union anymore, when the state still promised something, was not delivering, but promising help. Now it is not much help is promised, as families should be self-reliant, and mainly mother should take care of the education and upbringing of children. And also, of course, woman is responsible for instilling patriotic values in children. So how all of it is functioning and why women are supporting this, how it could be realized if the general promise of traditional values is not so good for women, yes? What I found from my research, that there are several women's organizations, so-called non-commercial organizations, which are really state-dependent organizations, which are promoting state values, traditional values, family values, combining them with some kind of version of protection of women's interests, of women's health. My main focus is this organization, Women's Union of Russia, which is actually the head of the Soviet Organization Committee of Soviet Women. In difference to the Soviet organization, this seems to be very powerful regionally. It has regional chapters in all the subjects of the Russian Federation, so it is a kind of guaranteeing control of the center over the ethnically diverse population. So women in all parts of the Russian Federation should be somehow mobilized by different means, of course. These are regional organizations which are planning it. So this is important imperial component also. And the organization is promoting happiness of motherhood. Here some medals for mothers which were introduced in regional level even earlier than they're discussed now on the federal level. It is, of course, all this kind of campaigns for motherhood, for giving birth. This is campaign +1 in place of doing abortion. The organization also is training psychologists who will convince women not to make abortion. They're also promoting on its webpage these campaigns for not doing abortion for some particular day of the year, for example, different kind of propaganda and education. All of it is combined also with different events, festivals, fairs, seminars for promotion of women's health, even if sometimes it is promotion of health of the elderly women, but mainly it is about women, future mothers, how they are addressed. So here are two pictures from Tatarstan, for example, and in the second picture you see the special kind of course for future mothers, for pregnant women, and traditional values are also introduced as a part of this course. So how these women should bring up their children. Traditional values are also part of this mandatory course for children in school, which all children in the Russian Federation should attend and learn about traditional values. But women's organizations are trying to diversify their activities. At the same time, women's organizations, the state-dependent women's organizations, they are very much involved in different so-called volunteer or activities for supporting kind of our soldiers, our warriors. Women are encouraged to collect parcels for sending to the front, for producing all kind of garments for the front, knitting, making mask nets, candles, and so on. These are from Tomsk region, both of these pictures. And also women's organizations are practically participating in this growing militarization of the society through different patriotic events, opening special desks in schools for those who have perished in the war on Ukraine, bringing family members, bringing children. Children sometimes are wearing military uniform, including girls, as you see in this picture. So all of it is of course, combined with rhetorics that women are mothers, that this organization is caring for welfare of women and for women's interests, how it is called. It is not only organizations, there are several other organizations. This one, for example, is rather new. It does not have Soviet past, Mothers of Russia. And here, this is Primoria region, and a special photo exhibition for those wives of mothers who have their husbands and sons fighting in the front. So they are invited to be proud of their relatives, show it, of course, to their children, and to be photographed with military uniforms of their husbands and sons. So all of it is kind of populist content of how the war and traditional values are trying to be attractive and are made attractive, and how all of it is combined. And now I'm coming to my final slide, really. So if we summarize, it is possible to say that traditional values conservative maternalism spread by broad network of actors. Only some of them define themselves as religious organizations connected to the Russian Orthodox Church. Convergence of different actors is happening with open support of the state in the form of presidential grants, for example, or direct participation of the local administration in different events organized by Women's Union of Russia, which I was discussing. So the aim of controlling reproductive capacities of women's bodies and social reproduction in order to strengthen Russia's geopolitical position in the world. And the suffering of women and mothers in Ukraine, children in Ukraine is fully silenced. You know that now this is a case of the criminal prosecution of Russia because of abducting and stealing Ukrainian children. But all of it is not part, of course, of this rhetoric. This is part of the reality. So the convergence of actors spreading traditional values makes this ideology to get stronger position in the society, in spite of its open rejection by part of the population, but rejection in the context of the authoritarian dictatorship is very difficult, contestation and resistance. And so what was defined as a demographic problem before in the situation of the aggressive Russian war against Ukraine is presented as if women are responsible for the lack of human and economic resources for the imperial war. And I will stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for that, Yulia, for that very kind of like deep dive. And again, you know, seeing the imagery so important, albeit very disturbing. And thank you as well, because you give us a lovely segue into our final speaker's contribution. So Dr. Dora Gioffi is a professor of economy, and you mentioned the kind of economic resources there. And here we are going to get an emphasis on the economics of Russia and the link to autocracy. So Dr. Gioffi, over to you, please.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Okay. Do you see the slide?
Yes, we do. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be part of this fascinating conversation. I will refer back to the previous speaker in my presentation. I started with Luke. I gave this title, Economic Cost of Autocracy in Putin's Russia, because I agree that it would be an overstretch if we called Putin's policies as populist. So I want to keep the 15 minutes, so let's jump right into the problem. So what we see in Russia is the growth rate since 1991. We see that after the initial transition years, the first decade, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which also led to the collapse of the economy, Putin became popular with very high economic growth rates in the first decade of the 2000s. And then this growth slowed in the 2010s. And what we see that especially after the occupation of Crimea in 2014 and the sanctions that followed, Russian economic growth has been meager. And this changed with the war. So in fact, the 2022 growth rate was a mild recession, less severe than the COVID recession. And this is surprising because many expected that the sanctions will collapse the Russian economy. And instead, what we see that in 2023, a 3.6% growth rate was registered. And for this year, the IMF expects a 3.2% rate. So now we see an important discussion about failed sanctions. And what we see is that Russia was able to redirect energy trade to the use of a shadow fleet, which is able to avoid the G7 oil price cap. The same was not possible for gas because of the missing network to China and the global south, but oil could be redirected from Europe to China, India, and Turkey. We also see widespread evasion of sanctions, and the International Working Group on Russian Sanctions has an excellent paper on this, which maps how Russian imports of battlefield goods in 2023 occurred. And what we see is that China is a main supplier of Russia, but what we see on this field is that by changing the country of origin, the country of seller, the country of dispatch, actually G7 goods are making their way into Russia, and Russian imports have recovered. Russia has also avoided banking and currency crisis, so in fact the economy proved to be much more resilient than expected. In my presentation, however, I would like to emphasize that this is the short term, and Russian economic prospects in the long term are much darker. So to give a theoretical background, what we know about economic growth. So I start with the Solov model, where growth is dependent on capital, labor, and the efficiency of their use, which is productivity. Paul Krugman, Nobel Prize-winning economist, has a famous quote that productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it is almost everything. And the question is, what determines productivity? And basically, this is physical capital, human capital, technology, and non-economic factors, institutions and culture in particular. So what we mean by institutions come from Douglas North and other Nobel Prize-winning economists who argued that property rights and the enforcement of contracts are crucial for long-term growth as they determine the incentives for desirable economic behavior. And most recently, Deirdre McCloskey in several books has argued that it's not even institutions, but rather ideas assigning dignity and liberty to ordinary people, which are best for economic prosperity. And in the following, I want to give you some data about how these factors are changing in Russia. So let's start with capital. So since the war, Russia has lost access to the Western financial market. It is cut off from the SWIFT network. It has assets frozen in the Western countries at the range of $300 billion. Western companies have mostly exited Russia. They incurred losses around $107 billion. And we also see that FDI has dried up, and the bottom figure shows the number of greenfield investments in Russia since 2019, and we see an enormous decline actually tending to zero, which also means that Western companies are leaving Russia. They are not investing in Russia, but China and global South countries do not step up and invest in Russia. They don't invest either. And there is an inflation pressure in the Russian economy, which necessitates to keep the interest rate at a high level. So it's 16% right now, and this is prohibitive for business investment. So what remains in terms of financing? So and this comes from Vladimir Milov's excellent article at the Martin Centers. I recommend it to everybody. So what remains is the current account surplus, and this is what you can see on the top graph. So basically, as energy prices soared after the start of the war in 2022, Russia incurred enormous amount of increase in export income and enormous current account surplus, which could be used to finance the war. However, since the peak in 2022, it's steadily decreasing. So exports decreased 28% due to sanctions, and imports rose by 9%. But this is not necessarily volume, but rather increased transaction costs. So the graph I showed you earlier about how difficult it is to smuggle goods from the West into Russia, it means high transaction costs, and it also means higher prices. So Russia is exposed to the global South countries who are able to charge more for Russia because of its weakness. The second possible source of financing is coming from the National Wealth Fund. This was $184 billion in 2022, and it decreased to $136 billion by April 2024. And if we only consider the liquid portion, which is made up of yuan, 60% and gold, 40%. This fund went from 113 billion to 53.5 billion. So it's being exhausted. The second issue is labor, and in the previous presentation by already touched upon it by Julia, and what we see is that Russian population decline started before the war, and here I have the table. So basically, the COVID crisis already started population decline, and Russian demography has been problematic since the transition, but migrants from former Soviet republics have sustained the population, and you can also see it on this table. So several 100,000 migrants arrive to Russia every year. But after the war, this changed, and that migration turned negative in 2023. The estimation of Russian forces killed or wounded during the war against Ukraine is 350,000 to 450,000. And there are also an estimated 900,000 Russians who emigrated. There are many educated professionals, and there are estimations that 30% of all IT engineers left. So what measures we see against population decline, and this is what Julia's excellent presentation has shown us. So limiting abortion access is an important element with the support of the Russian Orthodox Church. The state is increasing payments for having children. We have also heard about that. And we also see the abduction of Ukrainian children, and some estimates range at 700,000. But it is highly unlikely that these in themselves produce sustainable results for Russia. Talk about technology. High-tech sectors in Russia have been dependent on Western technology, especially computers and electronics, where 35% of foreign inputs come from motor vehicles and transport, 27% foreign inputs, Western inputs, machinery and equipment, similar percentage. Import substitution has proved problematic, but we have seen that sanction evasion is happening, and we also see this is another table from Bank of Finland authors, Koronen and Simola, and what we see is that the sanctioning countries, there is exports are declining to Russia, but from the non-sanctioning countries, exports are increasing, and we see that part of these exports are actually coming from the West. But what is important is that while Russia is able to procure high-tech products, and China plays a crucial role in doing that, there is an unwillingness to provide technology, and this is what we see in the lack of investment. Now I'm turning to institutions and freedom, and we have also heard a lot about this, and institutional conditions have been steadily worsening since Putin assumed power, and the graph is from the World Governance Indicator, and basically the area of the covered by the 6 dimensions shows the quality of governance, which is a crucial predictor of long-term growth, and we see that it's getting smaller and smaller. Basically, there are weak property rights, an unaccountable state, and scarce incentives for economic success in Russia for private entrepreneurs or actors. And the 2010s have shown that there is a lack of structural change in the economy. So Russia remained mostly reliant on trading in raw materials. And basically, this is also the role China is trying to assign Russia. And it's not really economic success, but national sentiments and prestige projects which support legitimacy. And now the war, and we have seen from Alexandra's presentation about the importance of the issue of security. Konstantin Sonin had an excellent article in Foreign Affairs in 2023 about the institutional impact of the war. Russian economy has been dominated by the states already in 2015. The Russian economy was 55% statist economy. And after the war, we can see an even greater state involvement in the economy, which stifles private initiative. The mass mobilization, so every month Russia is mobilizing 30,000 people, basically forces companies to negotiate for keeping their workforce, and it's a threat in the future, but also currently that there is a danger of the return of decentralized corruption and roaming violent groups that happened in the 1990s. By private and voluntary armies coming back from the front who can threaten business activity. So basically, in such an institutional system, any ingenuity is likely to focus on smuggling missing inputs and dealing with criminal groups rather than innovation and competitiveness. So to conclude, autocracy has severe economic cost in the medium and the long run. Russia has become asymmetrically dependent on China. The Chinese interest is to procure cheap raw materials and an important ally in their fight against the West, but not to help Russia develop. And while state spending on the war sustains economic growth, the long-term outlook for the Russian economy is dire. Basically, what we see is the war has undermined every factor of long-term growth, including capital, labor, technology, institutions, and freedom. But in the previous presentations, we did not really hear about the economy, and the reason why is that shared prosperity was never exactly an objective for Putin's autocracy. Legitimacy is likely to remain based on national sentiment, victimhood, consideration of security, and force. And thank you for your attention.
Many thanks, Dora. A really important contribution there. I guess my question is whether there could be a good economy under an autocratic system. So, but we'll see if these kinds of questions come up in from the audience as well, because I know I find it very frustrating when I'm sitting in a webinar and I'm told that there will be a Q&A and there never is time. So I'm going to stop talking and see what, if any, questions we have coming from our audience for you. Bulan, is it best just to will we give voice to people?
Yes, please.
Yep. Okay, wonderful. So I see Lamia, if forgive me for using your first name, would you like to put your question, please?
Yeah, thank you so much. I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm coming originally from Azerbaijan, a journalist who is based right now in Europe. I'm very sorry I joined this wonderful talk in the middle when Luke just mentioned that Putin is populist but anti-mobilizational, which triggered lots of questions in my mind, like how come, particularly after the full invasion of Ukraine, like many people are particularly they're choosing the way to, male ones, to migrate to Caucasus and through Caucasus to Turkey and through Istanbul to Europe. They're finding way to evade from this mobilization. And my second question is to Yulia Gradskova. I really loved all these details in your presentation. My question is, I really wonder how the Russian authorities they are using the religion, particularly Islam, in manipulating the woman and their motherhood. But when I really monitor the Russian media platforms, I really see that authorities, they really do not care motherhood, particularly when I recently saw the case of exiled journalist wife's, Kirill Martinov's wife, persecution and trial in Moscow. She was actually sent to jail. Many say that because of the false, claims. So yeah, I'm really curious about how the Russian authorities are using religion in manipulating, all these ideologies or ideas in the society. Thank you so much.
Many thanks. I'm happy to take a couple of questions at a time, if that's it. Would anybody else have questions or comments? Bülent.
Yeah, thank you very much, Maxine. Thank you very much for these exciting and intriguing presentations of the panelists. We all have some understanding of Putin's game plan, actually, and the extent he might go thanks to his illegitimate occupation of Ukraine. I wonder how a shift towards the right in the European Parliament, Moody's re-election, and Donald Trump's possible return to power might affect the Putin's regime's ambitions regarding neighboring regions and countries. How emboldened would Putin feel by these developments? What would the world look like with the addition of Trump to populist far-right leaders or Islamist civilizationist leaders such as Putin, Xi Jinping in China, Modi in India, Netanyahu in Israel, Erdogan in Turkey, Orban in Hungary, and many similar actors in power? My question is directed especially to Professor Luke March, but other respected panelists are also more than welcome to contribute. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just to kind of maybe add then my question. So, Alexandra, could I ask you to talk a little bit about the kind of resonance of popular culture among the populists in Russia? So generationally, but also regionally as well, please. And then Dora, just on that question about can an autocratic regime also be a successful economic one? So are there prospects for things not changing too much in Russia in terms of autocracy, but changing in terms of successful economic growth? Luke, shall we begin with you, please, and your answers to these questions?
Yeah, great, thanks. Just briefly, with the first question, I think to clarify, I said Russia was not populist and anti-mobilizational, because being populist and anti-mobilizational would be a different dichotomy. And you're right to focus on yes, there's a war going on and there's mobilization going on, but it's this essence that the regime can't really acknowledge it, because it doesn't call it a war, and it's a partial mobilization. And as I think some of the later panels, the later papers talked about quite well, a lot of the war support effort is kind of delegated to kind of private individuals, and the burdens put on women especially. And it's a long way short of what one might expect as a kind of full-blooded, this is a war, we need mobilization, and all of these kind of things being open. It's very kind of diffuse. And again, a lot of the most gung-ho, bloodthirsty rhetoric isn't coming from Putin himself. It's people like Medvedev who talk about Satanism and nuclear war. So it's kind of, again, the state as such presents itself as the moderate arbiter, and it lets kind of private, kind of semi-state voices do the kind of talking. And again, a lot of the things are going on in an unacknowledged way, because I think the reality, if the regime was public about the need to go to, we are at war with Ukraine, and it was open about the number of people being killed, then that's a very different dynamic. Moving on to the point about the kind of rightward shift and the populist shift. I think this is a critical year, and I guess I'm more worried about Trump's re-election than that of right-wing forces in the European Parliament, simply because of the American impact on, as we've seen, the American impact on war funding, and the relative also the relatively low powers of the European Parliament, and the fact that we haven't really acknowledged, because they didn't come up, that the populist right and the populist left in Europe are divided about Russia at the moment. So people like Meloni, for example, aren't pro-Putin, but some are. I think there's a kind of feedback loop here, and it's all coming down to what happens on the battlefield, because this year, as we know, Russia's beginning to be on the ascendant, and if it continues to be so, then the kind of the voices saying we need a ceasefire, and that ceasefire is going to be more on Russia's terms, are going to grow, and the kind of doubts about continuing military funding and those kind of things, and those will be reinforced by populist forces. And it's also an open question about those elements of the radical right and left in particular, but also the mainstream, who are currently very doubtful about Putin's Russia, and have been at least kind of nominally supportive of Ukraine, whether they continue to be so. So yeah, I think we're in a pivotal year, but ultimately I don't think it's the battlefield that decides it. And should Russia actually not gain much territory this summer, then actually some of these worst case scenarios maybe don't look as bad. And then the pressures that were talked about in the last presentation on the economy, etc., will increase as well. But there is a worst case scenario, and I think you're right to focus on that.
Thank you. Could we, Alexandra, could we come to you? I can't hear you. No, I don't know whether it will be worth you going out quickly and coming back in. I'm sure somebody will look for you coming back in. And then meanwhile, I'll go to Yulia, if that's okay. And actually, Yulia, I just wanted to add a question to you as well, which is how you square the circle of this kind of reification of motherhood, and yet increasing domestic violence that we are seeing in Russia, and actually even the legalization of it to a certain extent with recent changes in the law.
Yeah, thank you very much. You can hear me, yeah? Okay, good. So I will start probably very briefly with Bulin's question about what will happen. I just left aside in my presentation all this transnational cooperation part, but of course, I mean, cooperation between conservatives from the United States and from Russia, it started long ago, and you know, I would refer first of all to research by Christina Stoical, but there is more research about it. The organization, very conservative organization, World Congress of Families, was founded by one Russian representative. It is actually very active in the United States. So of course, Trump coming to power will reinforce all of it, but it exists. It exists paradoxically in spite of all the anti-Western campaign which is going on in Russia. This kind of cooperation around traditional values, anti-abortion, pro-life, and so on, it exists even now. Yes, so it just will be worse. Then to Lamia, I think I guess it is more like two questions. One of them. First, about how religion and Islam are used. Yes, Islam is used. Well, it's more difficult probably for the Russian government to really use Islam, having into this past, all this colonial politics, to wars in Chechnya and so on. But still, there are some cooperation. There are organizations which are also supporting in republics like Dagestan, for example, the Mufti is always invited even by this women's organization. I could find it on the webpage. So regional chapter in Dagestan of the Women's Union of Russia, they can invite Mufti to some discussion on traditional value. So it functions like this, unfortunately. I do not know how it is on other levels, but yes, it functions. And then probably to combine these two questions, what Max and David asked and you about care for mothers, but of course we should not think that the Russian state should care for mothers at all. I mean, the arrests in domestic violence, arrests of mothers, it is not only this case, but Lami, you made this example. There are many political and not political, absolutely like cultural professionals who are arrested, like this very famous case now by Svetlana Petrechuk and another regisseur, theater regisseur, who have children, who have adopted children. Their children are suffering very much, but mothers are not free from this totally invented, totally artificial political charges. They are not free because they have underage children at home. They should be home, so they are kind of straff they receive, they should be less. Yeah, it is not happening. And the same with domestic violence. Really, there are not so much discussions, and any independent women's organization really cannot exist now in Russia. Only clandestinely, only like feminist anti-war resistance, which exists as a network and is totally anonymous. So you can't really, you cannot really advocate for strict legislation of domestic violence. But the state is pretending in some regions, for example, in Tomsk region, I think it is pretending that there are something is done. Also, there are some campaigns trying to help alcoholic mothers in Bashkortostan. There are some kind of shelters even, but all of it is getting more and more rhetoric of traditional values. So you can get help on the base of traditional values, and then it means that, well, it is not real help against domestic violence, of course. So yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you for that profoundly depressing description of what is going of the landscape for women in Russia. Alexandra, let's see if we can hear you.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, great, thank you.
Finally. So if we have I understood right that your question was about the response from the audience to these messages, right? So, or you are mostly interested in the kind of the perceivance of the audience of the messages. So what was your question? Can you remind it to me?
Yeah,
please?
I'm wondering if these, I mean, especially music, right? So it's very often generational, isn't it? Okay. So I'm wondering if it kind of speaks to older generations or just reaches certain generations. And then I was also wondering about whether it travels over the kind of entirety of Russia as well. So basically, who is listening to it, but then certainly hearing more about the kind of responses would be really good.
Well, yes, so obviously that, for example, that rating which actually shows the popularity of Shaman, who is actually recognized as the most popular singer, according to the last survey, he's based, the rating is based on the opinions of the youngers, obviously, but we can find other Z singers who actually are working on different audience regarding different ages, and so I just didn't mention them, but they definitely exist. and they spread approximately the same messages. So meaning that they support the Putin's discourse, they promote this so-called traditional values, conservatism, and a huge bunch of anti-Westernism, Russian imperialism meanings. So they work in support of this anti-Western Russian imperialistic discourse. So that's why they called like Z-singers. But it's interesting that if we look at, for example, at Russian opinion surveys, as it was conducted in November last year, we can see that the Russian society feel two controversial feelings. This is they terrified by the war on one hand, and the second feeling that they have is the feeling of proud of being Russian. So this is a very strange situation, because this is definitely can't say us about the coherence. So this is not the coherence. So people don't feel coherence despite these all attempts of Putinism discourse to solidify the nation. So this is not happening. And definitely people kind of feel lost, because they don't know how to respond to the question. They do not whether they have to demonstrate solidarity, loyalty to the state. They understand that this is the state of oppression, and they have to demonstrate the state support. But at the same time, they definitely have feelings like lost. They don't want to demonstrate support to Ukraine because they terrified by the repressions, etc. So, and another interesting thing, if we look at the surveys also, is that people again response that they feel stability. It's also a very interesting thing, because even despite that all these sanctions and a lot of people left country, they still try to find kind of stable in society. And yes, it's very kind of structured regarding the age groups. So we can see that actually youngest, they trying to leave country, and but the older generation, let's say older than 55, they demonstrate more support to Putin's discourse, and it also very much depends on gender. So, for example, male, they more in favor to support war with Ukraine than women. And I also add some notes regarding the question on women and children. We can definitely say that Russia does a Yakovlev law, which was issued in 2013, which actually focused on ban of adoption of Russian children. If you know this law, it was issued in 2013. It bans adoption of Russian children by foreigners. And also we can see that children also a source of manipulation by the state in terms of kind of repression focused on unloyal people, unloyal group to the state. And children also a tool of manipulation in terms of oppression of liberal groups, also trying to incarcerate them. So we can see that children is a kind of political source for the Russian state. Same example is Ukrainian children, which actually again kidnapped and a kind of interest of adoption in Russia. But at the same time, so if we look at Russian children, they are not protected at all. They we can see a lot of orphans in Russia who suffer from different diseases and etc. So this is just a fiction, I would say. So, and the idea of the protection of mothers, the idea of restoration of the Russian nation is just a matter of rhetoric.
Okay, thank you. You froze just then, so I wasn't sure whether you were quite finished or not, so just wanted to give you time. Yeah, and I think that kind of moving forward, I can see that, well, I mean, probably 15 to 20 years, it will be really, really important that we are looking at the generations that, you know, kind of like growing up now, the under 15s, and where they stand in relation to a lot of the issues that we're talking about, and health, kind of thought more widely, especially in terms of mental health as well. Dora, you have been very, very patient there, but we did have questions for you, so please do answer now.
I try to be very concise. I answered two questions. One is Bulent and the other is Maxine, yours. So first about the Trump possible election. It's a very scary prospect. Right now in Hungary, we have an extremely populist European parliamentary campaign by the government. Basically, it's war or peace, and everybody else stands for war, and the government stands for peace, and the government believes that it is the only one that stands for peace. When people ask, so what does peace mean for you? Is like stop funding Ukraine. And when Viktor Orban went visiting Trump earlier this year, he came back, he said that, well, Trump would end the war in a day, and by not giving funds to Ukraine, the war would end. So that's basically the recipe, which is highly concerning. So let's turn to the big question about whether a good economy is possible under autocracy. This is a huge question in economics, so I try to be very concise. So basically, obviously, we have many examples of good economy under autocracy. So Chinese growth is probably the most obvious. But basically, what is institutional economics teaches us that so it is possible to grow from a very low level of development by moving people from agriculture to industry and industry to services. So that's possible, and then it is also possible to grow in an autocracy from low levels by importing technology and skipping the technological development stage. But basically, as countries get closer to the technological frontier, the more important it becomes to have the institutions necessary for innovation and creativity, and this includes checks and balances and freedom. Basically, the only exception from this is Singapore, but there the quality of governance is very high and corruption is very low. So China is the big question now, whether as it kind of West is de-risking and you know to globalization or this kind of trend. So is going on, whether China is able to develop its own technology. Chinese growth is decreasing steadily in the past decade, and there is a large discourse on the middle income trap in China. So basically, it's the best case. But for Russia, when everything is missing, capital, labor, technology, I don't see a good economic.
Can I just ask a little bit? So there's nothing there to make us feel that there is room or an inclination for really just kind of fostering entrepreneurship in Russia.
I mean, I think it's pretty straightforward. So, who would like to be a successful entrepreneur in Russia, where they can worry about the state taking its enterprise anytime, or criminal groups harassing them? So I think private entrepreneurship is the Russian sphere is not exactly good for innovative private entrepreneurship. So they better go to the West and build up there. Simply safer. So the Russian economy is like now kind of this Keynesian militarism, when military Keynesianism, when Russia is spending on industry and giving high price for money for soldiers and their families, and that kind of stimulates demand. But you know, shared prosperity or good living standard for a population is something that I don't expect at all.
Thank you. Just wanted to push you a little bit on that because I think it's important to kind of get this out there. We do have a question actually for you, Luke, and I assume you can see the chat okay. So
yes, I've seen the question. I'm trying to decode it. It's a very good question, but quite complicated, and I'll just say that I'll do my best. I think the issue here is about the unity of different, particularly religious traditions, and how Putin does that if he's not a populist. I think my answer would be that there is another. There is another that he presents himself against. It's just not solely a populist other. So it's not about Western elites as such. It's about the West as a broader entity, maybe a civilizational entity, an entity, a cultural entity, a kind of values challenge, and it's that presentation. So it's that bigger narrative that he's got. He's become very anti-Western, and that is the enemy. So it's also based on the fact that it's unity against threats. Besieged fortress has been mentioned a lot of times, that kind of thing. But linked with that domestically, the appeal is fairly nebulous, and Putin talks about a kind of multiple confessional traditions. There's a kind of orthodoxy is the first amongst equals, but he'll talk more about traditional values than he will about religion as such, and conservatism and traditions, and that can incorporate a different range of traditions. And I think linking it back to populism and domestically and abroad, the key challenge here is that Putin can cultivate appeal, and his regime can cultivate appeal using a lot of different narratives, which are probably intellectually not necessarily compatible. So he can appeal to different groups, again, on the basis of a common threat, and by presenting himself and Russia as slightly different. So there's all kinds of groups who will support him, even if they are probably antithetical to each other. And that works domestically and abroad as well. So that's the short answer to a question that deserves a lot longer answer.
Yeah, I did just want to, just thinking about when you were talking about nationalism as well, and it is kind of related to this issue of religion, which I think actually you've answered quite well. But in terms of the nation, what is it, right? So for the longest time we talked about these kind of very different conceptions of what it meant to be Russian in Russia. So this ethnic. I think you've lost me. Okay, I'm back. Yeah, my internet connection just went. Sorry. So I'm just wondering how, what is the nation? All right, is this talked about at all? Is there a conception of a Russian nation at the moment? And I've especially been thinking about this in terms of mobilization, where we have seen certain groups being mobilized much more heavily than others as well. So it's almost like a hierarchy about who matters in this nation. So we've got 2 minutes, but I don't know if anybody just wants to come in on that.
Not me so much, no. I would just say I think different narratives. It's a kind of shared identity, particularly in the current conjuncture. It's particularly through the Great Patriotic War and shared sacrifice, again against common enemies. But it's obviously based on a very stereotyped view of history as these that doesn't, the 1,000 years of unchangeable history under the Russian state, which is very, very dubious historically. But again, I think there are different narratives that are employed to different audiences, and some of them are more ethnic nationalist and xenophobic than others. But again, I think there's a lot there that others can probably answer better.
Thank you.
If I can add a little bit, yes, I totally agree that totally agree that these are different narratives, but also different national histories are chosen, different traditions, different parts of memories. So everything is kind of selectively adjusted to the great narrative, and then it functions. I see it in my women's organizations material. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bülent, do we just have time to carry on and just give the word to Alexandra, or do we need to?
We have to tolerate.
Okay. All right, Alexandra.
Yeah, just very quick. I would say that the ideological motives are not the key one for those who go to this war, because economic reasons are the most important for those people. And yes, if we look at kind of ethnic structure of mobilized people, so we can see that there is definitely kind of disbalance between those people who came from so-called ethnic regions and those who came from, for example, Moscow region. But actually, this is not because of ethnicity, but because of economic reasons, because people from so-called ethnic regions, like from Buryatia, for example, these are from poor regions. So, and people are interested just in earning money, they want money, and they have a lot of credits, and they just want to earn money. So I would say that economic reason is the principal reason for those who are ready to go and earn money, but actually they just die because of the war. And about the nation, again, I can't say that this is a kind of idea of the nation. Is not an ethnic nation, like Russians should be ethnic Russians. So the key idea is to be loyal to the state, to share these conservative values, to be orthodox, which actually could be somehow related to the idea of the ethnicity, but this is just somehow related. So I can say that Russian nation is ethnically centered. So I would say that the central idea is Russian imperialism, which is a kind of combined thing, and also the loyalty to the state. So these two key features of the idea of the Russian nation. Yeah, thanks.
Wonderful. I think that that's a very, very useful note to end on. And as far as those of you involved in the centre are concerned, maybe something, for a longer conversation, really, because we may be, thinking about the entirety of my life that has been really kind of dissecting nationalism and how bad it is and how it has been responsible for so many ills on the space of Europe. Obviously, we do seem to be back here again, but thinking about some of those that I am teaching in university, I'm not sure that they are actually, that this is very much in their minds as well. So again, I would just really like to thank the organisers as well as our speakers for this really, really enriching and revealing conversation. Thank you so much, and to be continued.
I will just briefly conclude. 1 second, sorry, thank you. So I would like to thank, of course, all the panelists that were here with us today for taking the time and for the insightful presentation. And also, of course, Dr. David, for your great moderation and assessments. I would also like to extend a gratitude to all the attendees that were here with us today and that enriched also with question and remarks. I would also like to point out that our next panel is going to be on June 20th on the topic of tracing the pathways of autocracy and authoritarianism across Central Asia. So if you're interested, just please remember to register and join us. So again, thank you all very much for being here, and I wish you all a great rest of the day.